Hello, everyone. Welcome to ICAS Experts Voice Initiative Program 2025. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director and Senior Fellow with the Institute for China-American Studies based here in Washington, D.C. The Expert Voice Initiative, in short EVI, is a series of interviews with leading experts addressing many of the significant issues on China-US relations and the impact on many of the global affairs and global issues such as climate change, trade technology, and ocean governance, maritime security, among others. In 2025, ICAS is going to launch a new series of EVI with a focus on the Arctic. So we are going to host leading Arctic experts from the Arctic 5 littoral states and also other stakeholder nations to share the research and their perspective on many of the key issues on the Arctic, including geopolitics, international law, shipping, navigation, environment protection, among others. So today it's to kick off this series of Arctic, series of EVI. It's a great honor to host our first speaker, Dr. Adam Lajeunesse. Let me quickly introduce you to our audience. Dr. Adam Lajeunesse is an associate professor and chair of the Public Policy and Governance program at San Francisco Xavier University, Canada. Dr. Lajeunesse is also the Arctic and Maritime Security Chair at the Brown Mulroney Institute of Government and the Director of the Canadian Maritime Security Network. You will find his full bio on ICAS website when we lead this issue of EVI shortly. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Nong. Thanks for having me.
So, Adam, as we observe, there's so many significant shifts on terms of the Arctic in recent years. We have been hearing a lot of debates on the role of Arctic Council amid the Ukraine and Russia conflict and the consequences sanctions on Russia. And later we heard about U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement, first in 2019 and again in 2025, of the possibility of purchasing the Greenlands. So many issues to discuss. So Canada, as one of the most important crucial states in ocean governance in the Arctic, and they plays quite a significant role in shaping the future of Arctic governance. So I'm pretty sure that our audience will be eager to hear the insight from Canadian perspective on these pressing issues. I will start by asking you, could you explain to us very briefly what is the strategy of Arctic from the Canadian perspective? Are there any significant shifts given the current situation in the Arctic?
Yeah, thanks, Nong. Well, as many of your readers or listeners, I should say, probably know, Canada has just released a brand new Arctic foreign policy. So this foreign policy builds on what is called the Arctic Policy Framework, which was released several years back. And what this foreign policy does is it brings up to date Canada's approach to the region in the light of the obvious significant shifts that you just mentioned. China's growing role in the region, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the general disintegration of international cooperation in the region through the Arctic Council and elsewhere. Now, the new foreign policy is similar to Canada's past policies in many of its basics. The pillars upon which Canada builds its Arctic policy haven't changed in fundamentals. So Canada's approach to the region is still built on a desire to expand Indigenous participation, on economic growth, on the defense of sovereignty. These basic pillars have underpinned pretty much every Canadian northern policy going back to the 1950s. However, what we do see are some real significant shifts in how Canada approaches the region and what we're now talking about. So the Arctic is no longer an exceptional region. This new Arctic foreign policy, simply put, recognizes the obvious. Arctic exceptionalism, if it ever really existed, is gone. The region is not separate from global conflicts that Canada and its allies have with Russia, and of course, that growing competition or conflict, if you will, with China. So this Arctic foreign policy and Canadian policy more generally is now much clearer about Canada's perception, its position on both Russia and China in the Arctic, and by extension, around the world. We are now looking at those two authoritarian powers, not so much as potential partners with whom perhaps we disagree but can work with, but now increasingly as clear competitors. And when it comes to Russia, as an enemy. So when we look at China, the new Arctic foreign policy is very clear about the dangers of Chinese dual purpose scientific research, hybrid threats, and of course, a lot of ink is spilled on both Chinese and Russian information operations, which is something that was not really at the forefront of any Canadian defense or foreign policy really ever. So now you've seen this big swing where it's not just submarines and hypersonic missiles, but now you're looking at this whole gray zone hybrid area. And we are almost equally concerned about the soft powers, the fake news, the disinformation that we see globally now being applied to the Arctic. You're also seeing a lot more lateral focus in an attempt to counter some of this. So Canada, for the first time, is putting a lot of emphasis on relationships with Greenland in the east and with Alaska in the west. We're opening new consulates. We're trying to increase cross-border mobility, cooperation. Now, part of this is, of course, countering these threats I mentioned, but of course, part is also to try and generate new productive relationships, new trade, new opportunities for investment, and thinking outside the traditional north-south box.
Thank you, Adam. I think that's pretty clear to hear from you what is the general strategy and the shifts. So you mentioned a bit about the China and China's role. So I would like to move on to the second question on how to view the stakeholders, nations which are not Arctic states. So I read your recent publication, Selling the Near Arctic States, China's information and influence operation in the Arctic. You mentioned briefly on China's role in the Arctic. Let me continue this conversation to ask you two questions along this line. How does Canada view China's increasing role and interest in the Arctic? And what are your thoughts about the implication of the increasing cooperation between Russia and China to Canada and also in the region? I know that you cover a little bit about that. If you want to continue this dialogue, I would appreciate that you also mention, if you want, you can also mention other stakeholders like Japan and South Korea.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a very important question. The most important way of framing Canada's consideration of China and the Arctic is to understand that when the Canadian government, and I would say the Canadian people writ large, think about and consider China's increasing role in the North, it is not being done in a silo. So Canada, and again, I say Canada very generally, let's say the Canadian government, it is not particularly worried about what China is doing in the North. Now, you wouldn't get that impression looking at the Arctic foreign policy. There's a lot of discussion, like I said, about hybrid threats, information operations, dual purpose scientific work. But it's not what China is doing in the North that is generating so much concern. What Canada is concerned about, and I would say the Americans and the Western Europeans as well, is China's behavior globally, and then, of course, within its own neighborhood. The Arctic is merely an extension of the West, to use that term, much broader concern over China's threats to the rules-based international order. And so it's not what China is doing in the North. It's the constant threats to invade Taiwan, to invade Taiwan, the absurd claims to the South China Sea, harassment of Chinese neighbors, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, Canada, the government, and I'd say the Canadian people, if you were to poll them, are worried that the Arctic is merely one extension of a much broader conflict with an authoritarian China. So that is what is really at the heart of everything. When the Canadians look north and worry about what China is doing in the Arctic, they're really thinking about Taiwan, they're thinking about the South China Sea, and they're thinking about how those conflicts, China's behavior there, can spill over into other regions around the world. So you mentioned the cooperation between Russia and China as well. Now that cooperative relationship is increasingly important for China because it has really lost most of its soft power across the entire Arctic outside of Russia. You go back 10 years, China was largely welcomed by the Scandinavians, Greenlanders, Icelanders. Even within Canada, there were a lot of northern premiers going to China looking for tourism, trade, investment. That's really dissipated over the last 10 years. Again, not because of what China's done in the Arctic, but because the Scandinavians, Canadians, Icelanders, Greenlanders are looking at what China is doing closer to home and realizing this actually isn't the partner we thought it was and not the partner we want to work with. And so the relationship with Russia has become really China's only access into the Arctic, the only avenue to influence Arctic governance. Now, it's not an alliance. It's often sold as an alliance. The reality is that it's a very transactional partnership. Russia and China have fundamental disagreements, differences of political and legal positions in the Arctic, whether it relates to regional governance, EEZs, transit rights, internal or territorial waters. There's big differences of opinion between those two. Now, the two governments, because they have a broader interest in cooperating and pushing back against what they consider to be an aggressive West, those disagreements have been tamped down and pushed to the side so that the two can demonstrate cooperation. But they're there beneath the surface. And so I think there's going to be a limit to how far that alliance, if you will, is going to be developing. From a Russian perspective, the Arctic is also evidence of its increasing reliance on China. Now, the Russians would like to see this partnership as a partnership of equals. It's not. The Russians are very much the junior partner, which is very, I think, off-putting to many within the Russian establishment, the military and the elite establishments, because that's not the historical norm for Russia. And I think it's quite grating on Russia to see itself becoming so subservient, so dependent upon China very generally, but particularly in the Arctic. Because while Russia is China's only access point to the north, China is Russia's only major supporter for Arctic investment, shipping, transportation, and of course, much more broadly for resources and investment generally. And so what we're seeing now, and in fact, the Canadian Arctic strategy kind of poked at this subtly, is China increasingly taking over and Russia increasingly finding itself dependent upon China. Now, there may be a point at some point in the future where the Russian elite become too uncomfortable with just how subordinate they are becoming to their neighbors to the southeast. But we'll have to see if that actually materializes.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to turn to the question on the U.S.-Canadian relationship in the Arctic. So how do you view the U.S. increasing the discussion and debate on building more icebreaker with the assistance, with the help also from Finland? How do you view this gesture? And how do you view the recent U.S. President Donald Trump's statement announcement purchasing Greenland? What's the implication for Canada and for this region?
Well, Canada is very happy to see the U.S. build icebreakers. In fact, we're trying to help them do it. That's the whole point of the Ice Pact, is to try and make continental, and of course Finland as well, icebreaker production smoother, cheaper, more effective, to create economies of scale. Now, we're not sure if it's going to work. We don't quite know where the Ice Pact is going to go. But the Canadian position is, of course, that the more American icebreakers there are in the region, the safer and more secure the Canadian Arctic will be. And of course, vice versa. You look at the Canadian foreign policy that's just come out, but of course, Canadian positions, policy, and implied, operational doctrine going back to the 1950s. The Arctic is one, or at least the North American Arctic, is one operational zone. So Canadian icebreakers, ships, search and rescue assets, they've always worked with their American counterparts. So the more Canadian icebreakers there are, the safer and the more secure North Alaska will be. And of course, the more American icebreakers, the safer and secure Canadian waters will be. So we're very happy to see the U.S. Coast Guard fleet expanding, as I think the Americans are happy to see our fleet expand. Now, as to the point you make of Greenland, I mean, that is obviously front page news around the world. Donald Trump is talking about buying or conquering Greenland, depending on how you read his words. I mean, I don't really have a whole lot to say about that, because no one really knows what's happening. no one really knows what is happening within the labyrinth that is Donald Trump's mind, whether this is a joke, whether this is a negotiating tactic, whether he's genuinely serious about this. I think it's fairly obvious that the Greenlanders have no intention of being purchased. Uh, whether the Americans are serious about acquiring Greenland territory or whether this is just leverage to increase their security presence, gosh, who knows? I think the Americans do have a clear strategic need to increase their presence in Greenland. So that might mean more economic presence to develop the rare earths that are in Greenland and to export them to the United States for processing as opposed to China. So that is a very real practical requirement. And then I think the Americans may, over the next decade or so, want to expand their military presence in Greenland as part of the broader modernization of continental defense, where we are looking at hypersonic weapons and new threats coming from or through the Arctic. So those are all very real possibilities, but that doesn't involve buying the country or or annexing the island. So where that political talk of annexation goes, I wouldn't venture a guess. We'll have to see over the next few years.
Thank you. And a related question, since the current U.S. administration is increasing its attention towards Arctic, so I'm wondering right now between U.S. and Canada about the legal state of Northwest Passage, and there's a temporary agreement, agree to disagree. Do you think with Donald Trump's current proposal, like changing the state of the Panama Canal, do you see a possibility the U.S. may change position on how it opposes the Northwest Passage of Canada?
Well, you never really know what direction American diplomacy is going to go these days. The Trump administration is predictable only for its unpredictability. But I would say some of the basic structural realities surrounding Can-U.S. relations in the Northwest Passage remain the same and have not changed since the 1950s. So it's not a temporary agreement. We have had a legal disagreement over the status of the Northwest Passage really since the 50s, and it crystallized around the 70s. However, it's a legal disagreement, and it's been relatively easy to push to the side so that the two countries can maintain operational cooperation. Now, the Americans have a clear disincentive to push this issue forward. In theory, if this dispute were to come to a head and it was brought to international arbitration or something of that nature, even an American victory would actually be an American defeat. Because if you think about what the American position means in practice, the international strait running through the Northwest Passage would give both Chinese, the Russians, and any American adversary free access through the heart of the North American Arctic. Chinese ships, Chinese blimps, or whatever assets American enemies may assemble could sail or fly freely, protected by international law, straight through the heart of the Arctic, right next to American and Canadian continental defense facilities. So it is actually not in America's security interest to win that fight in a strange, ironic sort of way. It's not really in America's interest to lose it either because of the potential global precedent that would be set. So what we actually find ourselves with is a situation where the status quo might actually serve the Americans and the Canadians better. And this is the status quo we've had since the 1950s. It was really enshrined in 1988 in the Arctic Cooperation Agreement, and it has remained in place unchallenged for so many generations simply because it works so well. And the dangers of challenging that status quo for both Canada and the US are so significant. So I don't foresee a major conflict surrounding the Northwest Passage, though who knows, there may be even an opportunity for some big deal on the subject. If the Americans were to accept Canadian sovereignty, there may be opportunity for Canada to compensate the United States in some other zone. Who knows? Donald Trump is certainly open to unconventional thinking, let's say.
Yes, unconventional thinking, that's the word. Now I'd like to move to discussion on the Arctic Council. We know that because the Ukraine war and there's a lot of pause and resuming of the work of Arctic Council, and there are also debates on whether that Arctic governance should be run by the second version of the Council without Russia. How do you view this debate? And do you think there's other alternative mechanism that can fulfill the job of ocean governance, including Russia, particularly in many of the area international research cooperation? We definitely will need Russia because it's actually one of the major Arctic states in that region. How do you view the current debate?
Well, I don't think that there's any other organization, or I don't think there's going to become any other organization that is capable of doing what the Arctic Council did. And if you look at Western policy statements, including the most recent Canadian one, they make it very clear that the Arctic Council remains the central governance body for the region, and it is not going away. It's on pause. It's very difficult to see the Russian state reintegrated at the political level until Russia's invasion of Ukraine is resolved. But you also see the working groups continuing to do their work. The Arctic Council is trying to find a way to generate some of the valuable knowledge, do some of the valuable work without providing Russia with the top level political cover and recognition that the Arctic Council offers. The Arctic states are not going to try and build a new organization without Russia. There's no point to do that. Quite frankly, if they wanted that, they could just use the Arctic Council without Russia. I think you're just going to see a sort of an awkward phase in northern governance for some time until Vladimir Putin is removed from power. You're just going to have this Arctic Council that functions in some respects, but is very much on hold at sort of the high level political level.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is about the security and geopolitics within in the Arctic. We see that Russia is increasing its military presence in the Arctic, and the NATO is expanding with the new member Finland and Sweden. And also see the US is talking about increasing the role of Alaska, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you define the current state of Arctic? And also, what strategy or recommendation would you suggest that Arctic could maintain in a stability and peaceful status?
Well, as I said, geopolitically, the Arctic has been sucked into much broader conflict. So the Russian threat to NATO is now manifesting in the Arctic. However, by and large, no one in NATO is particularly concerned about what Russia has been doing in the Arctic within a silo. That is only of concern because of Russian behavior in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, Georgia, and broader Russian threats. Very similar to China. As I said, no one was particularly concerned about China's Arctic presence. Indeed, up until 2017, 18, 19, most Arctic countries were quite welcoming of China's presence to do joint scientific research, trade, investment opportunities. China was generally welcomed. But that shifted because of outside factors. So it was Chinese threats to Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, bizarre approach to the South China Sea, coercive trade practices towards Canada, Australia, Lithuania, other countries. It was this general security dynamic that was spilt over into the Arctic and affected how Western states, at least, viewed both Chinese and Russian presence and activities within the North. So if you ask about how we create a safer and more secure Arctic, the answer isn't actually in the Arctic. The path to peace and stability in the Arctic runs through Ukraine, and it runs through Taiwan, and it runs through the ability of the increasingly defined power blocks to come to more global understandings about those critical issues. And once you resolve that, the Arctic falls into place very easily.
Hey, so now I would like to uh, bring up the question about indigenous peoples' right, because one of the key issues that agree upon by the whole Arctic Council, no matter Arctic state and also other stakeholders. So how does the Canadian government incorporate indigenous peoples' knowledge and priority in its Arctic policy? A related question is how does the First Nation Indigenous people of Canada view the foreign investment in terms of building its infrastructure, increasing investment in the Canadian North.
Well, Indigenous priorities or Northern local priorities are really integrated into everything that Canada, or at least the Canadian government now does in the North. So every policy that you will see from federal level grant strategies to service operational policies, Coast Guard strategies, Navy, Army, foreign policies, everything that is being put out brings in local knowledge and community centers, community interests. Now, whether that's bringing Inuit into the policymaking process, which is absolutely done in the North, or talking to individual hamlets to make sure that they're not, say, overtaxed by Army exercises. Everything from the grand strategic political level right down to the operational level, there is a concerted, organized effort by the Canadian government to make sure that Northern considerations are really meaningfully integrated. So the days of ignoring Northerners in their own backyard, their own home, those days I think are long over. Now, whether we can improve in processes for how we integrate this knowledge, there's something to be said, there's a debate to be had there, but the effort is very, very clear, very obvious. The most recent foreign policy, for instance, had, I think, several very good concrete objectives for centering those requirements and those desires. So Global Affairs is now bringing Northern youth in for paid internships to try and generate more Northern presence and sort of knowledge within Canada's foreign policy making apparatus by bringing Northerners down to Ottawa to put them into global affairs. The new foreign policy is looking to address some very clear Northern local considerations like seal product access and ivory access to the United States, the EU, something that Northerners have been very worried about for a very long time. And then, of course, I mentioned those lateral communications with Alaska, Greenland, improving cross-border mobility, improving, cultural relations and access to Alaska, Greenland. These are all very concrete proposals. I know Foreign Affairs was very serious about not just offering some broad generalities, but actually asking themselves and asking their partners, like, how can we make life better in the North? How can we gear our foreign policy in such a way that it really does support your practical needs? Again, maybe imperfectly, but the effort is very there. Same thing, the Navy is trying to integrate Northerners into their new Arctic offshore patrol vessel operations, thinking of different ways to bring Northerners onto the ships. Can we employ them in some way? That's very much a work in practice, but conversations are happening. The Army is, of course, as it long has been, reliant on the Northern 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group to train soldiers to be the force's eyes and ears to the ground. So Canada has been continuing this process of integrating Northerners and building Northern knowledge into operational and strategic documents for decades now. And I think we have reached a point where this is not just an important consideration, but it's actually central. The second part of your question, could you remind me? I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer.
Sure. I'm just wondering how the Indigenous people of Canada view the
Yes.
foreign investment.
Yes. How they view foreign investment. Well, I can't speak for Northerners, really. We do have some polling data, which allows us to extrapolate some of those viewpoints. Very good recent poll data from Greenland, for instance. And what I can tell you just from circumstantial conversations from the North, generally speaking, it seems that Northerners would prefer, across Canada and Greenland, to deal with Canadian, Western, Australian companies. They would prefer to find that investment not coming from China because Northerners are fully aware of the potentially coercive nature of Chinese investments. Right? China treats investment very differently from a Western company, how a Western company would approach investment. Chinese investment it's tied to Chinese political goals in a way that, say, American or Canadian companies would not be connected to their governments. So generally speaking, what I know from conversations and what we know from polling is that Northerners would prefer that investment to come not from an authoritarian power. However, there is that reality that investment is needed. And if it's not going to come from Canada, the United States, Europe, Australia, wherever the case may be, it needs to come from somewhere. And so what do you say to a community that needs a port, that needs infrastructure, but is not getting that money from any reliable Western source? Do they accept Chinese money that's being offered? It's very difficult to tell them, well, no, there's a security threat. You can't accept that money if there's no money coming from elsewhere. So one of the big policy challenges in the Canadian North is going to be, how do you provide that investment money in order to offset Chinese money that you are telling Northerners they can't take for security reasons? So if you're going to tell people that they cannot have investment in infrastructure for security reasons, the Canadian government, Danish government, the American government, their own spheres of influence, they need to be able to provide that fund instead. So I think that's the critical question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lajeunesse, for spending time with us. And thank you for helping us kicking off the first episode of this EVI series on the Arctic. So the next one, we're going to bring in an American expert, and then followed by a Chinese speaker in Russia, and also someone from Denmark to share their perspective on quite a range of issues on the Arctic. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Nong. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.